Today on the Bible Reading Challenge podcast, we are going to give an overview of the book of Deuteronomy. My name is Aaron Ventura, and I'm joined today by Pastor Doug Wilson. Pastor Doug, welcome back again.
Hi, thanks for having me.
All right, so Deuteronomy is the capstone of the Pentateuch. It summarizes Israel's history, and it sets up their conquest of the Promised Land. Can you talk first about the role that this book plays in the rest of the Bible for understanding how God kind of interacts with his people via covenant?
Sure. So the first thing we have to do is look at the position of Deuteronomy in the chronology of the Old Testament, and then ask if that has a typological significance for New Testament times, which I think it does. So the people of Israel are brought up out of the land of Egypt. They spend 40 years in the wilderness. They make covenant with God at Mount Sinai at the beginning of the 40 years. There's the abortive invasion. First they're told to invade, they don't, and then they do, and then they're beat. And so then they're forced to march around in a circle, basically, for 40 years. Then Deuteronomy is the second giving of the law. So the Exodus brought the slaves out of Egypt. The 40 years in the wilderness was getting Egypt out of the slaves. So
it took some time.
It took longer. It took longer to get Egypt out of the slaves than it did to get the slaves out of Egypt. So Deuteronomy is the second giving of the law. So we should think of it as an exhortation to the troops just before the Normandy invasion. So they're massing. They're getting ready to go into the Promised Land after a 40-year delay. And then the law is reiterated. So the law is given to them a second time. And that second giving of the law is a refresher course in what had been given to them initially. So that's the basic structure. In 1 Corinthians 10 and in Hebrews 3 and 4, we're told that the Jews in the wilderness had typological significance for the position the Christian church was in the time between the resurrection and ascension of Jesus and the destruction of Jerusalem. So that was another 40 years.
Right.
So Jesus was executed around 30 AD, and Jerusalem was destroyed in 70 AD, 40 years later. And on the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD, that was sort of the signal that sends the Christian church into the world, invading the world of Canaan. And so Hebrews 3 and 4 and 1 Corinthians 10 tell us these things were written as an example for us. All the doings that the Jews had in the wilderness were written as examples for us on whom the end of the ages have come. So and it's quite striking that there were challenges to Moses' authority in the wilderness. There were challenges to apostolic authority. The word of God was given to them in the wilderness. Well, the word of God, the New Testament, was given to the Christian church during that wilderness period time. There were great temptations to immorality in both places. A
lot of food problems too, right? We want quail. We don't want.
So basically, Deuteronomy, I regard the book of Hebrews as a New Testament Deuteronomy. It was written right on the, in the 60s sometime, right on the brink of the invasion of the world, just as Deuteronomy was written on the brink of the invasion of Canaan.
So one of the words that we as Presbyterian or Reformed Christians talk about a lot is this word covenant. And people like Meredith Kline and other scholars have looked at Deuteronomy and say it has this ancient Near Eastern suzerainty treaty format. This is a covenant structure. Can you just give us a succinct definition of what a covenant is and what we mean when we use a word like covenantal?
Right. So my working definition of a covenant is a solemn bond, sovereignly administered with attendant blessings and curses.
Okay.
That's how I.
Sounds like you've been asked this question before.
Yeah, I have a definition. A solemn bond, sovereignly administered. So it's not a contract It's not merely a contract, because two parties can come together and shake hands and say, I'll deliver so many widgets to you for this price by this date. And that contract is, we should keep our word, and it can be a solemn thing. Let your yes be yes and no, no. But it doesn't rise to the level of a covenant. A covenant is sovereignly administered like a wedding. A wedding is a covenant. There's God is the one joining the man and the woman together, sovereignly administered, with attendant blessings and curses. So if you love your wife as you love yourself, then if you love your wife, then he loves his wife, loves himself. There's blessing. There's a blessing on that. There's attendant blessings and curses in marriage. There's attendant blessings and curses in the covenant life of the church together. Baptism is a covenantal sign. I don't want to think of covenants as super contracts, but they're agreements, solemn. They're agreements or commitments or obligations solemnly imposed by an authority. The late Roger Scruton once said the difference between liberals and conservatives is this: that conservatives believe that I can have obligations that I myself did not choose. They were just given to me, assigned to me, and liberals think that choice is everything. I'm not bound by anything. If I didn't vote for this guy, or if I didn't sign up for this, then I'm not bound by it. Anyway,
one of the ways of outlining this book is to mark out 3 sermons that Moses gives. There's kind of a historical prologue, and then some people would say this is kind of a sermon. This is Moses preaching. He's reflected on the Exodus laws for 40 years. He's seen this people, and now he's like, all right, these are my final sermons before I die and you go in. Do you have an outline that you prefer, or?
Well, I think that this is very broad. It's that when the ancients had a structure or an outline to the book, they didn't necessarily do it the way we do Roman numeral 1 and A.
They didn't have chapters and verse numbers.
They didn't have it the same way we do. But I regard the book of Deuteronomy as roughly commentary on the Ten Commandments. So in Exodus 20, the Ten Commandments are given, but then they're reiterated in Deuteronomy 5, earlier in the book. So the Ten Commandments are given, and then much of what follows is like the Westminster Larger Catechism, filling out and pushing the standards of that law into the corners.
Yeah, I think I read the way that James Jordan outlines this book. He basically says, starting in, I believe, chapter 6, right after the Ten Commandments, and then he has kind of all these breaks where it's, all right, this is all about the first commandment, all about the second commandment. And it actually, I kind of looked it up, and it does seem to fit pretty well in what seemed like a lot of scattered laws at times. You're like, what is the governing principle for why this law is there? And it does seem to fit.
I think that there's a strong argument for that.
Okay. So let's talk about maybe the kind of most famous verse in the Pentateuch, and this is kind of like the Jesus is Lord of the Old Testament. We're talking about Deuteronomy 6:4, the Shema. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. And then right after that says, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your strength. So this confession of the oneness of God is unique when compared to the other nations. Can you talk about what this means and why is it such a big deal?
Yeah, it's a big deal because the thing that was unique about the Jews is not that they served their God, and not that their God was jealous, because other nations served their God and had jealous gods also. In fact, way more jealous. way more jealous oftentimes. What the Jews did is they served the God who made heaven and earth. I'm reminded of when Jonah was asked by the sailors, I'm a prophet. I serve the God who made everything. Oh, that one. So the pagan mindset was one that didn't have any problem with local deities. You serve your God is the God of the hills. Our God is the God of the plains. Your God is the God of that country. Our God is the God of this country. which made sense in a limit up to a point, because these pagan societies were ruled or governed by principalities and powers that they called gods, and which we would call demons or fallen angels, or they were either superstitious made up superstitious made up stories, or they were actual celestial beings that governed those nations. The Jews served the God who created all things, the absolute Jehovah. And that meant that this was one God and one law. So there's one word that governs everybody, which means that you can't settle for, well, you do it your way and we'll do it our way. It's the word of Yahweh encompasses the Assyrians and the Babylonians, and you see this later in the prophets, when the prophets when they're denouncing the evil behavior of various nations, they don't stop at Israel's border. They're not hesitant to say, and you, Edom, you've done this, and you, Babylon, you've done this, and so on. So all the nations answer to the one God. So it's not the one God of Israel, but rather it's the one God of Israel is the one God.
Can you comment on the relationship between a nation's God and a nation's laws? And right now, if you have kind of a so-called democracy, where you have many gods, you end up kind of with this polytheistic fighting over what the laws are going to be. And that seems kind of like the cultural moment we're in.
Absolutely. And so a lot of Christians, and this shows how modern Christians have been, I think, duped or snookered in this, because you'll have many Christians say, well, I think we can be good with pluralism, right? We can be good with pluralism. Well, what do you mean good with? What do you mean good with? And second, are applauding it as a system of governance? This is the way it ought to be. Because the theological name for pluralism is polytheism.
It's called idolatry.
It's called idolatry. So there's one God means there's one law. If many laws, and your tolerance for many laws means that you are tolerant of many gods. Okay? Now, I've said earlier, it matters what you mean. When Paul goes to Athens and he sees all the idols, he doesn't start throwing Molotov cocktails. He's distressed. He's greatly distressed, and he wants to plant a church there, and he wants to preach the gospel. So he makes his peace with the facts on the ground. He knows when you go to invade Canaan, you're going to run into Canaanites, and you have to fight them. So we live in a pluralistic secular society, and we have to make our peace with that in one sense. We can't be astounded when we when we meet a pluralist or when we meet a secularist. But we must not make an accommodation with it where we say, well, that's the way it should be. So Israel was not faulted for invading the land of Canaan and encountering Canaanites. Israel was faulted when she stopped fighting them.
Moving on to chapter 7, verses 6 to 8, I'll just read this section. We'll talk about it. But it says, "For you are a holy people to the Lord your God. The Lord your God has chosen you to be a people for himself, a special treasure above all the peoples on the face of the earth. The Lord did not set his love on you, nor choose you because you were more in number than any other people, for you were the least of all peoples. But because the Lord loves you, and because he would keep the oath which he swore to your fathers, the Lord has brought you out with a mighty hand and redeemed you from the house of bondage, from the hand of Pharaoh, king of Egypt." Okay, so this is election. And this is going to come up again in the New Testament. So what does God's choosing of Israel, a nation, teach us about what we argue about all the time, individual salvation or predestination?
So Paul appeals not only to this sort of thing, but so when Paul's talking about predestination and God's control over all things in Romans, he says Abraham. So God chose Abraham. That's a pattern for election. And then we reach in trying to get control of it. by saying, I'm an Ishmaelite, so I must. And he says, no, Isaac, not Ishmael.
Yeah.
And then we reach in and say, well, I'm an Edomite. And he says, no, Jacob, not Esau.
Yeah.
So God is, so that the calling, God does it this way, so that the calling and election of God may stand. All right. So this passage in Deuteronomy shows that God chose the Jews not for any ground of virtue in them. He chose them to be virtuous. He chose them to be a holy people.
Yeah.
But he didn't choose them because they were a holy people.
Yeah.
They weren't at all. They were just like everybody else. And so we are saved not by our good works, Ephesians 2:8-9, but we are saved to good works, Ephesians 2:10. So when God wants us to recognize his absolute sovereignty in selecting from the same common lump of humanity some clay for his own purpose. And he could just as easily have picked this other clay than the clay he did.
Yeah.
So what happened by the time of Jesus, and this is a perennial problem, the Jews were God's chosen people. It's the passage you just read makes clear. They're his chosen people. Well, that's very easy to get muddled up with, we must be God's favorite people.
Yeah.
If we're chosen, we're God's favorites. And the illustration I use is a teacher in front of a classroom who calls a student up to do a problem on the board. Well, that pupil who's called to do a problem on the board is the chosen pupil. Well, if he does the problem right, then he's blessed in front of everybody.
Yeah.
So the fact that he's chosen pushes all the chips to the middle of the table. If he flames out and embarrasses himself in front of everybody, he's still the chosen pupil. But that's why he flamed out in front of everybody. So when you read through the Old Testament, Israel is always the chosen people. They're always called to the front of the classroom, and 8 out of 10 times they flame out.
Right.
Right. And then there are a few glimmers here and there of brief moments where Israel starts to do it right.
Yeah.
And we get a notion of, this is what it would be like to have a student who actually did his homework and was prepared. And then we don't finally get a chosen one doing it absolutely right until Jesus. Yeah. So Jesus is the chosen one. He's called to the front of the classroom, and he does everything right. And finally, Israel does it right. Finally, the elect do it right. Finally, the elect don't flame out.
Yeah. So on the individual level, you kind of see this where you feel like, wow, I'm special because God chose me and he didn't have to. So how should Christians who are chosen, elect by God, think about their kind of place in being special but not special, chosen but not the favorite per se? What is that meant to do to us?
Yeah, it's meant to humble us, and we require a great deal of humbling. So in the typical Calvinist tulip, what we're talking about here is the U in tulip. It's unconditional election, but that needs to be nuanced somewhat, because it's not as though when we say unconditional election, we don't mean arbitrary election or capricious election, or
it's not duck duck damned as well.
Yeah, God's not up in heaven flipping coins.
Yeah.
He has conditions and reasons and purposes for his selection. It's just that none of those reasons are within us. So he's got holy purposes for picking me. They're just not the holiness of me.
Yeah.
So I'm set apart to holiness because of his holy purpose, not because of anything that was antecedently in me. So it's not capricious election, it's sovereign election. And there are purposes, God does everything according to the good purpose of his will, good counsel of his will. So it's intelligible, it makes sense. God's got a grand scheme, And the last day will reveal why he chose us.
Yeah.
But the one thing we know is that he didn't choose us because we were better looking than our brother.
Yeah. Yeah, one of the, the famous John 3:16 is this kind of, it's often painted as this universal love that God has for humanity. But here, if you are on the creaturely level trying to understand why God chose you, God tells Israel, it's not for anything, it's because I love you.
Right.
And there's a sense in which there's this special love that he has for his people.
Exactly. And we also have to remember in John 3, where God so loved the world, at the end of John 3, if anyone does not believe, the wrath of God remains on him.
Yeah.
So we have to constantly remember our starting point. So when we talk about election and we assume that we're all just sort of neutral in the middle somewhere,
Yeah.
and God chooses some to be saints and some to be scoundrels, but that would be unjust because we're being taken in both directions from a position of neutrality.
Right.
But if there were 10 prisoners on death row, and all 10 of them were absolute dirtbags, and let's say the governor pardoned 3 of them, because, I don't know, CIA, Dirty Dozen mission or something, he pardons 3 of them. And they go off and do their thing, and they're not executed. The governor has done no injustice to the other 7.
Yeah.
The other 7 die in their own sin. So when God chooses us, when God elects Israel, they were like all the other. Just like all the other nations, wicked.
Yeah.
They were like all the other nations, lost. So they're not. Not only does God not choose us because of goodness in us, he chooses us despite badness in us.
Yeah. The kind of, I think your average American feels entitled to God's love, or even your average Christian feels entitled to, like, at least everyone deserves a chance,
Right,
to believe. And this is one of those, we have to start with, what is our starting point?
So if you're entitled to grace, then it's not grace.
Yeah. I think Paul said something about that, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Now we get to maybe the most challenging part of the podcast, and who knows, maybe the most controversial. So we're going to talk about applying God's law to modern day, and I'm going to give you a few some of the scary verses of the Old Testament, and I'm going to start in chapter 13.
Okay.
With a great text on false prophets and dreamers. And so God says, all right, if there arises among you a prophet or a dreamer of dreams, and he gives you a sign or a wonder, and the sign or the wonder comes to pass, right? So they're able to actually do something. But they say, let us go after other gods, which you have not known, and let us serve them. You shall not listen to the words of that prophet or that dreamer of dreams, for the Lord your God is testing you to know whether you love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul. And then a little bit farther down, but that prophet or that dreamer of dreams shall be put to death, because he has spoken in order to turn you away from the Lord your God. Okay, so being a false prophet carries the death penalty here. Any comments on the kind of original context of this, and how would this apply today? Should we be trying to, execute prosperity preachers or something?
Yeah, televangelists.
Yeah.
Why not? In Deuteronomy, one of the things we have to keep in mind is that this 40-year period that's being wrapped up in Deuteronomy is a nation-forming time. Moses was with them through the bulk of that time, and his authority is challenged at different places.
Yeah.
Korah's rebellion and whatnot. So when a nation is first coming together and you don't have 200 years of inertia and tradition behind this is the way we do it.
Yeah.
Let's say the period after the American War for Independence, before the Constitution is shaped, there are all sorts of things up for grabs.
Yeah.
Nobody knows whether this group of states is going to divide and be against that group of states. Nobody, we
could have been
know.
two nations, or
could have been
more,
two nations. It could have been two or more. It could have been George Washington was offered the crown, basically, and refused it. And so everything's in flux,
Yeah.
right? And during this time, challenges to the existing authority are really momentous. It's not quite a time of war, but almost.
Yeah.
Right. You're in many times when a nation is launching, you're on the cusp of civil war.
Yeah.
And any moment if it breaks this way, you could have fighting in the streets.
Yeah.
And when someone in Deuteronomy 13 and in Deuteronomy 18, you've got the warnings against false prophets. And one of the things that would happen, you see this all through the Old Testament, is that rulers were supported by prophets.
Their advisors.
Their advisors, and they would say, yes, you should go up to battle. God will give you victory.
Yeah. We read the entrails. Or
Exactly. So that's the first thing. So I think that was the context in Deuteronomy for those things, which is not to say that we then wave our hands over it and say, and that can never happen again. Well, of course it could happen again.
Yeah.
Of course we could be in a similar situation, even though it's a new covenant era.
Yeah.
We just want to make sure that we've done our exegetical homework so that we know that we are, in fact, in a comparable situation. So I don't think that Deuteronomy 13 is warrant for us putting a death warrant out on Benny Hinn, or however many silly things he says.
Yeah.
But I do think that you could have a situation where someone had to be dealt with and needed to be executed for that reason, because the whole context was comparable. Everything about it was comparable.
Yeah. So it seems like as we're going through some of these laws, there's the application within the church context where Paul's going to actually take some of these passages. The ox treading out the grain means paid pastors. Who knew?
Right.
Or church discipline, excommunication. So he'll make that application, and we still do that within the church.
And we see that with Joseph and Mary. So, for example, in the Old Testament, if Mary had cheated on Joseph before they got married, she would have been susceptible to execution.
Yeah.
But the Jews were under the Romans and under Roman law at that time, and it says that Joseph, being a righteous man, resolved to put her away quietly, divorce her quietly. So there you got divorce substituted for execution.
Yeah.
And there are those sorts of transitions from Old Covenant to New Covenant as well.
Yeah, so there's kind of the ecclesiastical application, we might say.
Right.
Then we have the attempts at our current American system and ways applying it. And then we have the potentially in a Christian theocracy, say,
500 years from now, 500 years
Yeah.
from now, let's say there's an ideal biblical republic.
Yeah.
And let's say a revolt breaks out in a city.
Yeah.
And led by a crazed prophet, right, who said, we want to serve the Baals.
Yeah.
Okay, well, is Deuteronomy 13 relevant?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so, to bring out the John Calvin responsible for Servetus's death, that is one historical example of trying to sort through how would this apply both within the church for a heretic, and then also when you have a government who you're not it's not like a completely Christian government. This is one of those places where you'd want to figure out how to wrestle with it.
And what I can't handle are the Christians who just wave it off, who just say, well, we don't have to wrestle with it. That's Old Testament.
That's Old Testament.
No, we could easily find ourselves in a comparable situation, and we want to receive all biblical guidance. Neither do you want to wing off and be sort of an arch theonomic Ayatollah, where you're executing people willy-nilly, based on 5 minutes of Bible study.
Right. Yeah. let's do this right here. And maybe before we go into the rest of these, do you want to just make a distinction? So, theonomy in its kind of classical Bonson definition is different than probably the position that you or I hold, which would be more of like just what Westminster says.
Right.
Right. Can you just draw out what that distinction is?
Yeah. So if someone were to say, "Are you?" Ask me if I'm a theonomist, I would say, first joking, "Oh no, I hate God's law." Right. Well, you know what I mean. Well, actually, that's part of the problem. Mm-hmm. Even with Bonson's critics, they didn't wait to find out how he wanted it to translate out. In the West, when all is said and done, I would describe myself as a Westminster theonomist, meaning that they divide the law, Old Testament law, into moral, ceremonial, and judicial. Mm-hmm. Ceremonial is fulfilled in Christ. We don't sacrifice bulls and goats anymore. The moral law continues, as it always has. Yeah. And the Theonomy debates are wrapped up in the word judicial, because they said the judicial laws were for the nation of Israel and ceased when that nation ceased. Yeah. And then they give the rider, or the exception, that except as the general equity thereof may require. Yeah. So the laws of the Old Testament for Israel had a general equity in them, a principle in them that we're supposed to learn from and apply, and they're authoritative for us. Yeah. But the best illustration I have is in the Old Testament, they were required to have a parapet around the roof of their house. Mm-hmm. And that parapet is something we don't have to do anymore. Excuse me, we don't have to do anymore, because in the Middle East, they would go up on the roof of the house at night to cool off. Yeah. And it was like a second-story deck. Mm-hmm. And we don't have that, but we should require a parapet around second-story, balustrade around a second-story deck. Yeah. And if someone falls off your deck and you didn't have one, then you should be... You're liable for the damage. You're responsible for that. Mm-hmm. So I wouldn't have any hesitation going to the law that requires a barrier around your roof and citing that verse, saying, and this is why you needed to shovel your sidewalk in the winter.
Yeah, I've been preaching through some of the laws in Deuteronomy, and it's funny, looking at the commentaries, what biblical scholars just totally dismiss out of hand versus some of the more theonomic writers, a scary guy like Rushduni. At least they're trying to wrestle with the question. And so there's kind of two levels at which you could get the general equity part wrong, right, on the interpretive level, and you could have a debate there. But then you can also both get the general equity right and then have a debate over its modern application. Yes, so those are some of the distinctions we have to make as we're going through through the text. Okay, I want to talk about tithing here. So people argue about whether tithing is a New Testament practice or an Old Testament practice, whether it precedes, Abraham paid tithes to Melchizedek. How do you understand the tithing principles in Deuteronomy and any transference to modern day?
Okay, so there's a difference among the Reconstructionists. For example, Rushduni believed that the cumulative tithe was 23 1/3. Mm-hmm. There were 3 tithes, and he stacks them up serially. My understanding is that all 3 tithes were covered by the 10%. Right. So I think that and I believe that it's an ongoing obligation for today. Mm-hmm. So like circumcision, it preceded the Mosaic law, right? Because Melchizedek was tithed to by Abraham. Abraham tithes to him without any express commandment to do so. It seems to be embedded in the nature of things. Yeah. Then it's instantiated in the Mosaic Code and in Deuteronomy, and then it's appealed to in the New Testament. So Paul in Corinthians, when he's talking about those who preach the gospel should live by the gospel. Well, he appeals to the Old Testament Levitical system. So those who labor at the altar partake of the altar. Mm-hmm. So he's talking about the priests and the Levites, and then he says, in the same way, those who preach the gospel should be partakers of their labors. Well, the same way is tithing.
Yeah.
It's a tithe system.
Yeah. Moving into chapter 15, you have this section on the release of debts. And if you listen to the Leviticus podcast, Dr. Edwards and I talked about the kind of Jubilee law and the function that the 7-year Sabbath played. So is there a way, should we cancel all student loan debt right now? Or is there a way of applying this kind of principle to modern day? Do you have any thoughts on that?
I do. I think that I do believe that civil society should have restrictions on indebtedness, because what they're doing that's a restriction on slavery.
Yeah.
That's what they're doing. There's people should be allowed to enslave themselves in short-term cycles, but nobody should be allowed to enslave themselves forever and ever.
Yeah.
And so, and this is another general equity sort of thing. But around the time of the First World War, so the United States was an industrial nation, first world nation at that time. The average length of a mortgage on a house was less than a year around the First World War. Around the Second World War, it was something like 5 or 6 years. It took a special act of Congress to legalize 20-year mortgages. Okay, so it used to be, I would be very happy with a financial reform that said something like, that said you can finance a house, but you can't mortgage it beyond every 7th year. Right? So, because God's being kind to us.
Yeah.
The first house Nancy and I bought, we sold, I think, in our 6th year.
Okay.
We bought it, and basically the whole system is rigged against this kind of thinking now.
Yeah.
But so we had to do it sort of voluntarily, where we took a 30-year mortgage, but we were making principal payments on it, and then sold the house in the 6th year, so that we got out from underneath that.
Yeah.
Right. So there would be things that you have to work out, because what about long-term investments? What about business investments? Which is different than the prohibitions in the Old Testament of usury, which have to do with your poor brother.
Yeah.
So there's a difference between a poverty loan.
Yeah.
So the loan shark paycheck paycheck places in blue-collar neighborhoods where someone wants to get a loan advance on the paycheck, that's people are just enslaving people.
Yeah. The interest rates are crazy high, and
they're crazy high, right? And so I don't have a problem with a judicious magistrate not having a department of overseeing all of this, but simply putting these are the guardrails that you have to operate within.
Yeah. You mentioned the kind of system is stacked against you now, or our current real estate system incentivizes stuff that maybe runs counter to this. Can you make any other comments on ways in which biblical principles could be used to reform some of these?
Yeah, the part of the problem is that in the I don't want to say war, but in the tension that exists between debtors and creditors, you want to make sure you understand that there are righteous people and unrighteous people on both sides of that line.
Yeah.
So there are creditors who are sharks and who prey on the poor.
Yeah. That's their whole business model.
Right. And then there are people who then there are people who declare war on all creditors, and they say, so we're going to put in rent control in this big city.
Yeah.
Because we don't want greedy landlords siphoning off all the money. Well, presto, you just created a slum.
Yeah.
Right. You made it not possible to be a landlord and make a profit. So the places just fall apart. So there is such a thing as an honorable creditor. So, and there's such a thing as a dishonorable debtor who runs up the bills, who gets a 4-year degree and then 2 years in masters of underwater basket weaving and $75,000 in debt.
Yeah.
And then do we just scrub that debt off the books?
Right.
Well, no, we have to walk it out slowly. I think we'd have to first prohibit that kind of indebtedness over that kind of thing.
And we've talked about this maybe in other places about, so say a young girl who gets an abortion. So we would say that's murder. However, the Bible makes provisions for kind of high-handed sins versus sins of deception. So maybe her parents put a bunch of pressure on her to do it. She's been sold this idea that it's not really a baby, it's just kind of a fetus at this point, and she goes through with it kind of in ignorance. And we would say the abortion doctor, maybe her parents are more responsible in some way than she is. When it comes to something like student loan debt, which there appears to be a growing bubble of this, a lot of ignorant or just poorly taught students have ended up, they thought, I'm going to go and then I'll have a job waiting for me on the other side, and then those jobs weren't there. Could you make any biblical provision for those kinds of things? How would you get us out of this mess that we're in? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I wish I had. Wish I had a silver bullet on that, because if I loan you $3,000, I've got you. If I loan you $300 million, you've got me.
Yeah.
Okay? So it's true. The proverb says that the borrower becomes the lender's slave, and that's true in all ordinary debt transactions.
Yeah.
But when you get to extraordinary debt levels, all of a sudden it flips.
Yeah. The leverage pulls you the other way.
All of a sudden, the creditor is the one being held hostage.
Yeah.
At some point, the lender becomes the debtor's slave.
Yeah.
Okay. So I saw a cartoon many years ago where the World Bank, they're looking out at a couple of executives are looking out at a homeless bum tipping his hat on the street into the bankers, and one of the bankers is saying, "Oh, no, he's our best customer. He owes us billions."
When there was the kind of financial collapse, was in 2007, 2008, there were these bailouts. So what would Scripture teach us about the righteousness or unrighteousness of a government bailing out banks that have, basically made poor decisions or find themselves up in that?
So if you, again, Proverbs says that if you bail out a man with a bad temper, it says you will have to do it again.
Yeah.
Okay, you get more of what you subsidize, you get less of what you penalize. God is not mocked; a man reaps what he sows. And so the mantra at the time in 2007 and 8 was, those banks are too big to fail.
Yeah.
But when you have a system where things are too big to fail, you are subsidizing irresponsibility because
everyone else is like, okay, we should also get too big so that
to fail. And so basically, capitalism. There's a difference between what I regard a biblical approach to free market economics, which is different than being pro big business. So I'm an ardent capitalist, but I don't go at all for the government big business collusion that happens, which I call
it's called bribery, or
I call it capitalism. So what happens is being pro markets is not the same thing as being pro big business. Okay, so just a generation ago, some of the biggest corporations in the world were corporations like Kodak, right? which now isn't here anymore,
Yeah.
or airlines like Trans Am or Pan Am,
Yeah.
So there is an ebb and flow in free societies which budgets for failure. You have to have opportunities for failure, and I believe that that's a biblical God's law-based approach.
Yeah. Okay, moving on to chapter 19 and this section on cities of refuge. And this was if someone commits manslaughter, the axe falls off while you're out there chopping wood, and so you accidentally kill a guy. Well, there's still blood guilt, and so this is one of the things about God's law. It takes all blood guilt, or all the shedding of blood, very seriously, even
Right.
accidental. And so the man could flee to this city of refuge and be there until a trial could be sorted out. And there is this kind of history in the Christian church of giving sanctuary. If there's back when we owned physical buildings, you could actually find sanctuary in a church. How could we apply this today? And does it have anything to say to us about immigration?
Yeah, so there's a bunch of stuff there. You've got, even in the Old Testament, for example, when Joab goes into the altar and grabs the horns of the altar, he claims sanctuary.
Yeah.
That claiming of sanctuary is not unlimited,
Absolute,
because he's hauled off and executed for his misdeeds. So when someone claims sanctuary, it's not an automatic...
It's not a non-extradition status.
It's not automatic. So you have to process things when someone has claimed that status. When you look at the cities of refuge and the places where you can flee, another thing you have to keep in mind is what system was in place before that. So before Moses' law, and that scenario happens, the axe head flew off and killed somebody. The blood avenger, there was a tribal system of justice.
Yeah.
And so, and the tribal system of justice used to escalate. So when the biblical law says eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, what is being done there is God is saying, I want the magistrate to administer strict justice, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, because in the old system it was a life for an eye, a life for a tooth, and then the other side would come back and there'd be 10 lives for a life, 10 lives for a tooth.
Just escalates.
And then first thing you know, you're in a Hatfield-McCoy feud, and so excuse me. Ecclesiastes, I think it's 8:11, says, where justice is not speedily executed upon the criminal, there the heart of man is filled to do evil. So when you don't intervene right away, decisively, then a system of vigilante justice develops. So either the magistrate punishes wrongdoing, or people start taking it into their own hands. Now, when they take it in, so what Moses is doing is providing a system that the blood avenger had to respect.
Yeah.
So there's still that system in place, and it's still got people advocating for it. But Moses said, okay, these cities of refuge, it's like kids playing tag. Those are base.
Yeah.
Those are base. So you can still play tag, but those are base. Now, so I'm building up to your question about immigration. So the question there is, I think the cities of refuge should be utilized when someone is accused of a crime, right? Like murder, or was it murder or manslaughter? And then you need time to sort it out, and so you have a safe place for him to be while you sort it out. If you are talking about massive immigration across the U.S.-Mexican border, I think another part of Deuteronomy is more relevant there, and that would be Deuteronomy 28, the blessings and curses. If you are under God's blessing, you will be the head and not the tail.
Yeah.
You will lend to other nations; they won't lend to you. You're going to be in the driver's seat. They're not going to be in the driver's seat. And so, what our out of control immigration, the chaos on our southern border, indicates to me is that we are not the head. We are the tail. Which means that we're not under God's blessing currently. And I don't think you can fix that by letting all 150,000 of these refugees crowd into the church and grab the horns on the altar. I don't think you can solve that kind of problem.
Okay. One last one. So it says, a man, this is Deuteronomy 22:28. So if a man finds a young woman who is a virgin, who is not betrothed, and he seizes her and lies with her, and they are found out, then the man who lay with her shall give to the young woman's father 50 shekels of silver, and she shall be his wife. Because he has humbled her, he shall not be permitted to divorce her all his days. So I think you even saw a billboard, maybe on somewhere on the news recently, where it's like the Bible requires a woman to marry her rapist, and look how evil the Bible is. So what does this law mean, and just what's going on here? This is strange to us, right?
Yeah. So this is the kind of situation that you have with Jacob's daughter Dinah, where she was raped by, I think it was Shechem.
Yeah.
But unlike the rape of Tamar, where afterwards he hated her more than he had loved her. I think it was Shechem. Anyway, he loved her. He really wanted to be with her. We have a category in our own law, a category we call date rape.
Yeah.
Okay. So what an acquaintance of a young virgin who forces her. There are other laws similar to this. There's I think it's in Exodus where it says, but if her father utterly refuses to give her to him, then he simply pays the money. He pays the bride price. So this is not treating a woman like chattel slavery.
Yeah.
This is a protection for the woman.
Yeah.
Because what the rapist did in that society is he took away he took a great deal away from her marriageability.
Yeah. And therefore her financial her whole life.
Right. And so what this law says is if the family says, okay, the guy's a schmo, but I would be willing to have him for a son-in-law, and because I'm living in a country where this will be enforced.
Yeah.
He can't divorce her. He's got to pay full bride price. And if he's a serial rapist, kind of predatory rapist, the father would say, no, nothing doing. And then he would simply pay the bride price.
Yeah.
So this is not at all what it looks like to moderns.
Yeah.
This looks like you're selling your daughter.
Yeah.
It's actually a striking protection of women, really unusual for that era.
Yeah. There's this came up recently as people were reading through Genesis. You have this strange sin of Onan passage where Judah tells his son, go perform the duty of a brother-in-law. And Deuteronomy 25 is a section on Levirate marriage, and this is going to be a big deal in the book of Ruth.
Right.
So what was Levirate marriage, and why did God require this kind of law?
Yeah, God required it because in the Old Testament, the people of God were anchored to the land, right? And you perpetuated your name in Israel through land. It was an agricultural society. And so if a man was married to a woman and he died without children, then his brother would marry his former sister-in-law, and the first child of that union would be the deceased brother's child by proxy.
Right.
Okay, and then any children after that would be the living brother's children.
Yeah.
Okay, so basically, everyone in that time, men and women both, were very invested in having children. That was the shared commitment of all of them, men and women both, and I would argue was a far more biblical commitment than what we currently exhibit.
Yeah.
So God said, if a woman loses her husband before they've had children, God has made an arrangement where she can still have a child by her deceased husband.
Yeah. One of the things that C.R. Wiley brings up in his book, Man of the House, is this idea that right now children are liabilities, and that's how most people think about them, whether you have the dinks thing or limiting it as to as few as you can, whereas a biblical vision here treats them as actual assets. Can you talk about how in a day when financially things are trying to make children more and more a liability, how we as Christians can treat them and think of them more biblically as assets?
Through lack of subjects, it says in Proverbs, through lack of subjects, a prince is ruined. So we've been trained by basically the socialist centralizers to think of people as consumers. We primarily think, oh, look at all these mouths to feed. But in a biblical order, everybody's born into the world with one mouth and two hands. And these things are a metaphor. So you should produce twice as much as you consume. If you consume more than you produce, it's not going to be long before everybody's on the brink of starvation. So if you had said to someone back when the population of the world was 100 million, do you think this planet can support 7 billion? A lot of them would say no. Malthus would no. It's going to be famine, or Paul Ehrlich's The Population Bomb. We're not going to be able to feed ourselves. Well, every additional person who's born into the world is a resource. And so a biblical approach to people are not thought of as a drain or a liability. Now, it's quite true that in socialist countries, the more people you have that you can't feed. That's true. But the problem there is not the number of people, it's the socialism.
So in an agricultural society like this, as the children are, very young, they can still do substantial chores and contribute actually to the productivity
from very early on.
Very early on. Now, let's say you're an engineer or you're a coder, and there's nothing your kid could do to help you with your coding work. What are some ways that we can recover the children making a contribution to the household productivity when our work isn't so tied to the land like it was here in Israel?
The way we did it in our family was school. So school used to be teaching basic literacy, teach how to read and cipher, right? Now, your son might not be coding with you the way a son would work alongside his dad in the field. But he's going to a school that's giving him all the infrastructural education that he's going to need to become that, right? So basically, every household should be thought of as a center of production. And in our modern narcissistic era, we have made every home a place of consumption.
Of leisure.
Entertainment center, hanging out, like a designer family. Instead of having a family where everybody is hard at it. And they're working hard, they're diligent, the kids included. So I'm seeing it happen with my grandkids now. They are giving themselves to their schoolwork, and they know that this is what's necessary to make them productive at the same level that their parents are, or ahead of where their parents are.
Let's close with this section on blessings and curses. And I've heard you talk in the past about praying for Deuteronomic blessings on your posterity. How do these? So we're not under the Mosaic covenant, and yet there's a sense in which in Christ all the promises of God are yes and amen, and there's also some curses in the new covenant. So how should we read these? Because kind of blessings on obedience, curses on disobedience, and expect or pray for them today?
I think that the Deuteronomic blessings and curses are not abrogated, or I don't believe that they're erased. I believe that they're fulfilled.
Yeah.
And that means the blessings are accentuated and the cursings are accentuated. And so my prayer for my kids is that that God would pour out Deuteronomic blessings on them, not so much that they're overwhelmed, and not so little that they're discouraged. I want them to be given tangible, palpable, earthy, not worldly, but earthy blessings, so that they can serve God with their hands. They can serve God in this world. And when you're doing that, it's not an abrogation of the new covenant, because Paul doesn't have that sort of trouble. Honor your father and mother, which is the first command with a promise.
Yeah.
Well, that promise, it's in Exodus 20 and Deuteronomy 5. So the promise is that it may go well with you in the land the Lord your God is giving you. So the promise to the Jews was concerned the land of Canaan. The promise to the Christians encompasses the whole world. So God's not changing his promises, he's expanding them. So the upper limit for the Deuteronomic blessings is much, much greater than it used to be.
Yeah.
And the lower pit is also more horrific than it used to be.
The stakes get
heaven and hell.
Yeah. In Proverbs it says, a good man lays up an inheritance for his grandchildren.
Right.
And yet you have a lot of Christians who want to kind of just spiritualize all the blessings.
Right.
Can you just talk about that? So we don't want to do what Jesus says and just store up earthly treasure for earthly treasure's sake.
Right.
But there's a sense in which God has given us these things and wants a profit on them. So what are some principles for thinking about this rightly?
God is not a vending machine. He's not Santa Claus. He's not someone who can be worked. At the same time, the Bible is very clear, and is as clear about this in the New Testament as it is in the Old. That he who supplies seed for the sower is going to supply you with what you need. So in Corinthians, we're to whom much is given, much is required. Jesus says if you give up everything for his sake, you will receive back many times over in this life, he says.
Yeah.
In this life. It's not just in heaven when you die. So basically, I think that we have to become less Gnostic in our handling of the new covenant. The new covenant is new. It's not limited to one nation anymore. It's not limited to one people group.
Yeah.
But neither is it exiled to heaven only.
Yeah. Well, good job. If you are reading and made it through the Pentateuch, up next we have Joshua and the conquest of Canaan. So until next time, keep on reading.